Not too long ago, I covered the .NET 8 Identity Endpoints and its stateless bearer token authentication. With just a few lines of code, you can get all of these endpoints working out of the box. However, it's still lacking a bit of customizability since it's still in an early stage. So I'm going to present you with the alternative using JSON web tokens for stateless authentication. This will take a bit more time because we'll have to build all of these endpoints ourselves, but the upside is that it will be fully customizable. Let's start with the project setup. I built 3 projects, a shared API and database. Shared mainly holds the contracts to be shared between the frontend and the backend, which will mainly be the DTOs, the data transfer objects. For example, login requests, we are going to have to send an email and a password to the API endpoint to login, and that same request DTO can be reused in the Blazor forms, for example, to send that data over HTTP to the API. The API project in which we'll build the actual endpoints, and those endpoints will communicate with the database. Let's take a look at that. So in the extensions, I just add the DB context and that auth DB context, which uses the identity DB context with a custom user model, custom role model, and the primary key of string. Let's take a look at those custom models. Role using identity role with some extra properties. User likewise from the identity user, but has more properties, the name, language, and then those similar ones. The seeder just to seed one role into the database, and with doing the migrations of this DB context, we'll get all of the identity tables and extra columns that we specified for the user and the role. So let's dive into the API. Let's just start in the program CS. I did add some config files already. Let's see, so we add that auth DB context, that's fine, and then we set up everything related to identity and to make sure we can use those tables in our database. So all I need is identity core. I pass in the custom user model, the sign-in manager, to use methods like check password and sign in async. We'll see that later. Add roles to actually use custom role, and add default token providers to get tokens, for example, to confirm an email account via the user's mailbox or reset a password and so on. Those need to generate tokens. Then I added a JWT config, which will just get some values from the app settings. Let's take a look. So the JWT config with a secret and a time to live of 15 minutes. And I need that secret to configure the JWT bearer options. Let's take a look. Some options that will be evaluated when handling JWT tokens. And then configure auth options is just going to add some schemes. Okay, then I had to add this line just to enable the OpenAPI and Swashbuckle Swagger stuff. For the Swagger, I need that authorize button at the top, so you can do that using the OpenAPI definition security scheme, just like that. Add that to the Swagger gen, and then you should get a nice Swagger with that authorize button at the top. Let's see, so this authorize button. And then we can dive into the endpoints. I added map auth endpoints, which lives in the auth folder, and I made an endpoints CS file where I'm going to group the endpoints, but this time I'm going to be a bit more vertically sliced than before. So I'm going to have each endpoint inside of its own folder, and So let's get started building the endpoints. I'm going to try to use the natural user flow. So registration first, then confirm email, then login, and then all the rest. And here we'll do three things: create a user, generate a confirmation token, and send an email containing at least that token, but we'll send a nice link to the user, which the user can click and then confirm their account. Let's see, August VN, Milkit SMTP mailer. I'll quickly add that to the program CS, register it. Let's see. Go just add a singleton ISMTP mailer. Should be good. Now we can get that from the dependency container. That is request, of course. Okay, let's create that user. Let's say for new user equals await, and we're going to create user and pass down the data from the user request. Let's first add these lines in here. User manager, generate email confirmation token async, generated on the new user, and then to finally send that email, we're just going to copy this over. Subject will be, we'll put that in a nicer method later, but let's just do it now. Something like this, but then in an HTML tag. By clicking here, something like that. And this redirect URL will actually getting from the request, which could lead to your backend or to your frontend, to whichever URL you want to. I added that in for my use cases because that's mostly multiple Blazor frontends using the same authentication API, and it would be a bit strange to then be redirected to a different application, a different frontend, or to be redirected to the API. That's not really useful, so that's why I added that. Now for this create user method, that's going to contain about 40 lines of code. So either I put that in a separate method, another static method, but then it will have to pass down the user manager and maybe the logger, which will then have to inject in here as well. Or we just create another class that can use the dependency injection. I think that's preferred, and let's call it create user command. So like that. The downside of this is now we'll have to add that to our dependency container, to our service registry and that's going to get quite a lot if we have to do that for each command. The upside is we can use the dependency injection in here instead of having to inject everything in here and then pass everything down. That are two options. Feel free to pick the static method option. But let's register that one first. And I'm going to do that. I call this endpoints. Maybe I should call it extensions, because we're going to do more than just the endpoints. And map auth endpoints, but also, let's see, and then services dot create user command. And down here I actually wanted to use the map register endpoint. Yeah, and I'm gonna try to add all of the endpoints from these folders down below. So in the program CS we just have one line map auth endpoints, and then at the top we'll need configuration, just like that. Now of course we'll have to inject that create user command. Just call it command. Okay, the first thing in this handle method is to check if the user already exists. Well, we don't want to have duplicate users. Not to find the user by email async. If it exists, we're going to throw a forbidden exception or some kind of exception. Let's see, I'm just gonna use the fluent. We just want to exit that method, not do anything else. You may as well return in here if you need that, but then you'll have to add a check in here if it's null and then return a bad request or something like that. I can throw these exceptions because I added my handler in here, add endpoint filter, endpoint exception filter, which is also one I pre-built from a package of mine. Will catch forbidden exceptions, not found exceptions, and validation exceptions, and return that nicely to the consumer. We'll define the new user, and then we're going to try to add that user and return it if it was successful. So let's take a look at this link. I formatted that to go to my front end. In the front end, I'll likely have a page, a Blazor page, which can accept some route parameters, so the user ID and the code, and will then do a post request to the API to confirm that user. But for now, I'm only going to focus on the backend project, so we're not going to build a front end just yet. So let's rename this one to front end link. And that's going to be more like redirect URL and then user ID equals, and then with the query string parameters instead of, and then code equals token. Okay, I totally forgot the SMTP config to actually send the email from a valid email account. So I'm adding that to the app settings, and I'm going to fill out my email and password to send from. After which I have to add those options. Okay, and that should now work. Let's say confirm email. And I think that will be a map get. So the user can click the email and then actually just do a get endpoint, get request instead of a post request. That wouldn't work from an email. First, we'll check if the user exists. If it doesn't, we'll want to exit the method, do nothing else, just throw a not found exception or return and then return a bad request. That's up to you. If they do exist, try to confirm them by email, so the existing user. If not, we'll throw another error. So, okay, let's call this command query instead of command, since we're not really storing anything to the database. Add this as parameters to infer those user ID and the code as query string parameters, and then I return an OK result with a simple text. And in the extensions, I had to add that scoped and map those endpoints. Then I went ahead, registered again, clicked that link, and I got confirmation successful with the query string parameters, user ID and code. And everything looks good in the database as well. So what would be the next endpoint? It's probably login. So for the login, I created the mob login endpoint with a mob post and a method log user in with the login request. Make sure you're using the one from this project and not from the mob identity endpoints, not from the identity.data. And then underneath we've got the command. a DTO, but that also has the token type and the expires in, which can come in handy later on, but for now let's just return an anonymous type. And let's then check for the credentials. And after that we actually just want to return the user info, but also get the roles for that user, so the role names, to then create the access token. So it's actually just current user. I made a small mistake. Let's do the refresh token first, because to create the access token we'll need the refresh token. It's gonna say JWT config, then pass the refresh token and then the current user. Now we're going to create another command to store this refresh token in the database, but I'm going to have to rename this to login command, because otherwise everything is going to be called command, and then that should be something like refresh command. Let's for now just create this at the bottom, and we'll likely have to reuse that one once we implement or write the refresh token logic. And that will look as follows. We're injecting the DB context because this is the first time we're actually going to hit a custom table of our database, passing down that user ID. Let's see in here. So let's create that refresh token table first. It's going to store a new JWT, so new GUID for that user. So later, whenever the user tries to refresh the token, we can actually validate in our database whether we created that token. And then finally, we're going to return that new JWT ID, which is actually the refresh token. You could make that refresh token as complex as you want. You can encrypt it with all kinds of things, but for now it just needs to be something hard to guess. So we're just going to use a GUID for now. It might be a bit confusing that I'm calling the table refresh token and then I'm also calling this JWT ID refresh token at the top here, but yeah, there's room to improve. I'm going to add a few fields, so the JWT ID, which we're going to actually use as from now on the refresh token is invalidated. We can set after the fact and the user ID it belongs to and the expires at, so within 3 days. I'm going to add some extra fields from my package, which just contains that created at, created by, last modified at, and so on. And then we'll have to do a migration. First need to add the DB set, refresh token, refresh tokens, get set, make that a public, and then I'll go ahead and do the migration. Let's make sure we don't have any errors if we want to build a project. Create refresh token command, and I'm gonna have to add that as scoped. And now I'll create the migration. Let's double check the migration because it tries to remove my role. Let's not do that. Okay, always double check. So let's update. Okay, all went fine. We can continue. Let's see where we were. Login. So creating the refresh token, then it's finally time to create that access token, that JWT. For that, I went ahead and created a method in the JWT helper in here. So let's take a look, which needs that JWT config to access that secret, then the JWT ID, which is actually the refresh token, the JWT ID, that GUID, and the current user info. And then we're going to invoke two methods. First, the construct user claims with that JWT ID and the current user info, and then afterwards the create JWT. So construct user claims, just make a list of claims, add all of the roles, and then add all of the custom claims. So name identifier, the ID, the GTI, the JWT ID coming from the system identity model tokens JWT, because I had some issues with the sub. Then the email, the name, the locality, which would be the language, the mobile phone. So we're going to use a token descriptor to construct that token, and that needs the following. Let's see. And we'll get that as following, just get the bytes of that secret. So using a token handler to create a token according to the descriptor, and then write the token and return that as the access token. Of course, we first need to add these things, login command and the login endpoint, map login endpoint. Okay, apparently my secret was not long enough. It had to be, or not large enough. It had to be at least 256 bits. And so I added a few digits. And then I successfully logged in, getting an access token and that GUID as a refresh token. Let's now inspect that one. So at jwt.io, we're simply going to paste the token in. So I quickly redacted that to x.gmail.com, but now you see the name ID, so that's my user ID, the GTI, which is that refresh token or that JWT ID, the email, and then the expiration time. If I now were to change stuff, like, I don't see the roles because I don't have one, but if I now were to say something like, for example, admin@gmail.com and give myself admin roles, and I would try to use that token, that shouldn't work because I did not verify that with my secret. But more importantly, now that we have that token, we should be able to do authenticated calls to our API. So that's why we added that Swagger thingy. And that's going to be prefixed by bearer and then space and then the token. So that should be good. And now we could do authenticated calls, but we don't have any endpoints to authenticate against. So let's make that one. This one doesn't really need its own folder, but you could if you want to. That's actually simply going to be something like group.mapget, and then you could call it me or user info or whatever you want. Going to access the claims principal. We can call it user. That actually comes from the HTTP context accessor, and we can simply return results.ok and pass the, we'll probably don't just want to return the claims directly, maybe have a nice user info object, and it's going to be like var current user. Something we're gonna use that JWT helper again. Instead of create for user, we're going to do get data from claims and pass those user claims to list, or just like that. So let's add that method in. I'm going to add another method that get value from claims, since it's always just the same thing. Just going to do a first or default claim type value, and then we need to get roles from claims. That's another method I wrote that's going to look for those role claims and return that. Those permissions is not for this project. And then that should work. Then of course this is going to be that JWT ID, which I don't need, and the current user info, which is going to be the current user info. Let's run that. Well, I forgot one thing very important, and that is to require authorizations. Apparently I was missing add authorization. Login, get a token, and call the auth/me. Then I get my user info from the claims, which is nice. And that's an authenticated thingy. So if I were to log out and try that again, I should get a 401. Let's see what happens if I alter this token without including the secret. So I changed the email to admin and the name to admin, and let's try that, and let's try to get, let's see if we get information from the claims or not. So I'm going to authorize with that token. And let's see, that gives me a 401, bearer, invalid token, error description, the signature was not found. That's really, really nice that we're not reading out the values. I run the same experiment, but with a secret from another project, just to see what we're getting. And it says invalid token again, so that's secure. And now we could add another endpoint, maybe protected with some kind of a role. Okay, I quickly added a /auth/protected, a simple get method, but I'm using that authorize attribute on the role of administrator. I authorized, of course, at the top with that new access token after logging in, and I see a nice 200 response. So that means it's all working, so that's the protected endpoint. And in the JWT token, you can now see I have the role of administrator. So now we can register a new user. That user can confirm their account, afterwards log in and get the user info. If it's an administrator, even access that endpoint. So let's create the refresh token endpoint to refresh both tokens. Let's maybe rename that to refresh tokens. And let's just call the method refresh. Now we already created that command, but it currently lives in the login because that's the first place we needed it. So either we now extract that into a file just in the auth folder, or we're going to move that refresh token command in here. It might make more sense, but it's a bit of a crisscross. Let's see. And Let's try that, and then now we're going to do a couple of things here. First, we need to get the claims from the tokens, then the user info and the JWT ID from those claims, so the data from the claims. Then we need to set the isUsed property on that refresh token, so we can't use that one again. So in the database, just an update. And then we need to create new tokens, both a new access token and a new refresh token. To verify and decode that token, we'll also need to have that secret, so passing the access token and the secret. If there are no claims or valid claims, we can return a bad request or just crash, throw an exception, exit the program. Otherwise, we're going to get the data from the claims. This method we already made. This time we do need that JWT ID to create new tokens from, or to update the refresh token. If something in there isn't valid, we're going to return a bad request again, and then we're going to return those. Oh yeah, okay. Not gonna. First things first, get claims from JWT. Let's make a new method underneath. And this method is actually going to verify and decode the tokens to then get the claims out of it. So has valid algorithm, separate method. Let's add that below, which is simply going to check the header algorithm. So this has valid algorithm just does an extra check on the token whether the header.alg algorithm is the correct one with the one we encrypted the token with. But of course, validating the token happens first. Okay. So then we've got the claims. Then we get the user data and the JWT ID from those claims, which is the refresh token. And then we need that JWT ID to verify in our database, was that actually a JWT ID that we created, that our API created and gave to the user. So I'm going to create a class at the bottom, this command, and paste in the handle, and that needs that JWT ID and the user ID. So let's take a look. I'm injecting the user manager, the AuthDB context, and the logger. And then the handle method is first going to get the stored refresh tokens where the JWT equals that one. So validating whether that was a token that we gave out, that we possess. Otherwise it doesn't exist and it's forbidden. And then we're doing some more checks on the expiration time and whether it's already invalidated or already used. Then we don't want to continue, again forbidden. If it is all correct and valid, we're going to do one more check on the user ID to see if that token actually belonged to an existing user. If that's not the case, forbidden again. If everything went fine, we just update it to is true, update that. And if no exception occurred in this refresh token checking and updating, then we can create our new ones, which would be Let's see, the access token we can do with the JWT helper, and then this time we're going to say create JWT, but not for user. Yeah, well, from claims this time, which is similar, but let's see, we don't have the method yet. That's going to be similar as the one for user, so I'm going to copy it on top. But the only difference is for the user, we actually create claims first, well, construct them, and in here we already have the claims, so we just call the create JWT, so a new access token. Okay, what do we need in here? The JWT config.value and then the claims that we got at the top. And for that we need that same create refresh token command, but we have a naming issue again. Let's call this one update command, and then the next one, let's see, create refresh token command, create command. That's not the best name, but let's roll with it. Await create command dot handle, and that needs the current user dot ID. Let's not forget to map the endpoint and to register the commands in the extensions. Let's see, scoped, set refresh token is used command. Let's add the map, what was it again? Refresh tokens endpoint. So I logged in and I got myself a set of tokens. Let's try to refresh those, and then we should get new tokens. Authorize, and then get the, and I got my user info, and even the role is in here. I'm going to end the video here because all of the other functionalities are not JWT related. It's simply checking some user information, whether it be the email, the ID, or the code, to either reset the password or resend the confirmation email. That is just some repetition of what we already have. I will make sure to finish all of that before I publish it on my Patreon. If you want access to that code, make sure to become a member, then you can access that. I might even move some of the code, of the authentication code, to NuGet packages. If you want access to that, make sure to subscribe on my Gizcode website. So I covered user registration, confirming the user account, authenticating, getting those access and refresh tokens, then using those tokens, getting the user information, and even access a protected route that needs the administrator role, and then a possibility to refresh those tokens. I focused on the backend, on the API, because I recently already covered all of the front-end stuff in my brand website YouTube playlist. So you could find the code for the front end, I think, in the bearer token authentication with Blazor. That's on the identity endpoints, but for the front end it's very similar, since it's just a different type of token, but doing the calls to the API, storing the tokens into the local storage, handling the forms, that will be very similar. If you liked this video, if it was valuable to see the JWT authentication alternative, do hit that like button and subscribe for more to come. If you really want to see a part 2, for example, including the front end, So then you both have the front end and the back end, the entire flow for the JWT stateless authentication. Let me know in the comments if you want a part 2 or if you want to see anything else related to that JWT authentication. I hope I see you in the next one.